Welcome to Take or Give, the podcast where we give you a behind-the-scenes pass to the aid and international development sector. We explain exactly how it works beyond what you'll read in the headlines or on social media, or in fact, what you might see on TV. I'm Lorriann. I'm the founder and director of a political consultancy called the Advocacy Team.
And I'm Alex. I'm an independent researcher, advocate, and actor working in the sector.
So, welcome to Series 1 of the podcasts where we will break down some common myths that prevail about the international development sector. We will outline the myths and explain to you why they are, in fact, false.
So, in episode 1, we gave you a quick rundown of everything that's been in the news lately about aid and development, and it's been quite a lot. But in today's episode, we're going to take a step back and we're going to give you some of the tools that you'll need to understand exactly what aid and development really means. The kind of 101 introduction, if you will. And that's going to set us up perfectly to bust our myths.
Speaking of, in all of our time working in the international development sector, we've both found that there are basically two common perceptions of international aid. First is the idea that aid is just a massive waste of money because it goes to corrupt governments, nothing changes, and the so-called West should just stop giving it.
And second, that countries that give aid do so selflessly and out of the goodness of their hearts, and that all they're trying to do is help those quote-unquote less fortunate.
But what if we told you that neither of those realities is at all accurate?
Okay, to start with, what if we told you that aid and development haven't produced the results you might expect them to, because they've always operated more like a plaster or a band-aid, rather than a long-term solution to some of the biggest challenges we all face as a global society. So that could include poverty, inequality, conflict, global health challenges, and the climate crisis.
Let me invite you to consider a few things we take for granted a little more closely, as I think they explain why the development in its current configuration is actually set up to fail. The first thing is, if you think about the big portfolio of things that governments do overseas, whether it's defense or it's foreign affairs or it's trade, governments tend to be very realistic in their ambitions. So for those of us in Europe, you'll know that we are hearing increasingly from our political leaders that there is a realistic proposition that Europe could be at war in the coming years. That's an example of how governments are injecting a real sense of realism about foreign affairs, security, foreign policy. But when it comes to development, all of that caution and all of that realism just goes out of the window. And our political leaders and many others, and yes, some of the leaders in the development sector, have told the public for the last 70 years to buy into these big ambitions that international development by itself will end poverty, that it will deliver prosperity for all. And yet, the individual development projects and programs are not designed to achieve these big, lofty goals. So if you take something like women's economic empowerment, the big, lofty goal says we will empower women in rural communities across Africa to achieve economic sustainability. The individual project that will be funded, the goal of that project will be, we will reach 312,000 women in rural Malawi with gender-sensitive financial education. It is a good thing to reach 312,000 rural women in Malawi with financial education. That will lead to good outcomes. It means that the project has achieved the goals that the project set out to achieve, but it doesn't take too much of a stretch of the imagination to see how that project does not deliver against the big goal, the big ambition of women's economic empowerment. And that is by design. Development, it sets out these big ambitions and it measures progress using something called the log frame, which I learned when I first moved into, when I started working in the development sector, actually has its origins in US military history theories about how to design and run and evaluate programs. And so these are how programs are designed, and these are how programs are evaluated on these very narrow metrics and criteria. And that is the first gap that I would suggest exists in development. And then we need to layer on top of that development projects funded by any rich country is only one tiny slice of that government's overseas operations. So right now, governments who are funding development projects are also actively involved in armed conflicts. They are actively involved in imposing trade barriers. They may be actively, financially, militarily, through intelligence, supporting opposition groups in autocratic states. They are actively pursuing all of these goals, all of these objectives, and they're doing so alongside the development programs that they're funding. And they somehow expect, or they somehow tell the public, that the development program will by itself transform societies, transform economies without engaging with these big structural other activities that these governments are engaging with. And so the analogy, I was thinking about an analogy for this, and I think it would be like me eating my a salad once a week and expecting that salad to deliver good health, and just ignoring all the beer that I've been drinking, and ignoring all the pizzas that I've been eating, and all the cigarettes that I've been smoking, or ignoring all of the other stuff that's going around it, that this single salad is going to deliver good health. And so that's why I'm putting it that development is kind of set up to fail.
I'll be taking the analogy of the salad forward in my life, Lorriann, and trying to eat more salad too. Because here's the other thing that we really, really want you to know at this juncture. The general public was never meant to know anything of what Lorriann just outlined. You are meant by design to buy into the narrative that foreign aid is about, quote unquote, helping countries and people that are less fortunate. Because anything else would basically interfere with the perception, right, that countries in the global north, by the way, this is a term that we'll be using to describe what you've probably heard of as the West, or even worse, the term developed countries. We could honestly do a whole episode about this, so let us know if that's of interest. But you've heard that countries in the global north are charitable. They have good intentions. They want to help so-called poor people around the world out of the goodness of their own hearts. So, with this in mind, it can feel really jarring to discover all of the things that Lorriann outlined if you had truly bought into this broader narrative and had no way of knowing how things really are on the inside. Because let's face it, very few people actually work at the heart of, inside the development sector, and have access to the kind of information that we're trying to share with you today. So, I mean, let's take it right back, Lorriann. What were your very first impressions of development when you landed your first job in the sector?
So I always say crept into the development sector through the back door. I didn't study at SOAS, and I was working in UK politics and lobbying on a UK domestic agenda. And just there were some overlaps between the issues I worked on in the UK and some of the development issues. In my case, it was around children's rights. And so that's what allowed me to secure a policy role in the international development sector. And actually, my first experience was really unusual because I was working for a major charity who have a really formal induction program. And so when people start with the organization, they gather all the people who have started within the last 3 months, and they put them all through like a formal induction program where they really introduce it. And it happened just by coincidence that my first day was the day that that program was running. So I didn't wait 3 months. So like on day one, I was starting with all the people who had joined over the last 3 months. And I happened to sit next to a woman who is still a friend of mine. And she was a seasoned development expert and professional, and one of our country's most incredible thinkers on feminist leadership. And she sat next to me and she kind of just explained as they were going along why this is really patriarchal, why this is really backward thinking, why this is. So really from day one, I had the experience of just questioning things that I'd never questioned before. I had never, ever until that day questioned a child sponsorship model. I actually just thought, well, that's nice. It's a nice thing that somebody would give £2 a month and that money goes towards helping a child. And so I had somebody who on day one was breaking down to me all the ways in which a child sponsorship model was problematic. So I was very lucky in that respect.
Yes, I mean, that's quite the introduction to the sector. Whereas in my case, I feel you crept in through the back door. I just fell through the door accidentally without really knowing there was even a door there. So I guess for a little bit of brief context or background. So I was born in South Africa. So I was raised in Johannesburg, but then moved to Brazil and grew up in Brazil. So these were countries in the global south, but where in the parts where I grew up, there was no sort of visible development industry. Whereas there are some countries around the world, if you travel there, there's sort of big banners with the logos of different countries from the US, the UK to France, etc., saying, aid from the American people. It's a visible thing. So I'd never encountered that. Yeah.
I once saw that on a dustbin in Grenada.
Correct. Correct.
It must have been a recycling program
yeah.
where it said there was a garbage bin and it said funded by the European Union.
Exactly.
I apologize for interrupting.
Well, you've just exemplified development in one fell swoop with a beautiful image there. It truly is. I think we can't emphasize enough to the listeners that in some countries it's a visible industry and in others it's invisible. And so I just ended up in the consultancy side of the sector, and I was delivering projects, funded by global North government donors, so UK, US, Switzerland, and more. And honestly, cue a fairly rapid descent into Wonderland. I kept waiting for things to make sense. You know how sometimes you're convinced that everybody else in the room is just smarter than you and they just know what's going on and you don't? Well, the penny just never dropped, honestly. Things became even more and more difficult to understand the longer that I stayed in what I would call the mainstream part of the sector. And so when I started to work for myself, I could give myself that induction that you were talking about, that kind of what a dear colleague used to say to me about having a political education of development. So once that was possible for me, it became easier to see what was really, really going on. And so all of that is a preamble to today's episode and the motivation behind the episode, which is that, well, honestly, we're going to do something that very few brave souls attempt, for good reason, which is to give you a clear, simple, and concise explanation of exactly how the development sector works. So what it is, what it does, the basics.
Before we dive in, let's take a step back and just ask, why is there a development sector? Where did it come from? Has it always existed? How does it work? Are there rules? Let's play. These are kind of questions that, yes, there are answers to, and we want to take you through a few of those answers now. So most accounts will tell you that the development sector as it exists today was essentially born out of the post-World War II, post-independence, post-colonial era, with the goal of promoting economic growth for those poorer nations around the world. The vast majority of them had been colonies or former colonies of Western powers. And some have attributed the first mention of the term development to the US President Harry Truman, Truman, in his inaugural presidential address in 1949, which was also the very first televised inauguration address. And in this address, Truman makes 4 key points, and the fourth one talked about a new concept for the US development.
We believe that all men have the right to freedom of thought and expression. We believe that all men are created equal because they are created in the image of God. From this faith, we will not be moved. The American people desire and are determined to work for a world in which all nations and all peoples are free to govern themselves as they see fit and to achieve a decent and satisfying life. Above all else, our people desire and are determined to work for peace on earth, a just and lasting peace based on genuine agreement freely arrived at by equals. In the pursuit of these aims, the United States and other like-minded nations find themselves directly opposed by a regime with contrary aims and a totally different concept of life. That regime adheres to a false philosophy which purports to offer freedom, security, and greater opportunity to mankind. Misled by that philosophy, many peoples have sacrificed their liberties, only to learn to their sorrow that deceit and mockery, poverty and tyranny are their reward. That false philosophy is communism. Communism is based on the belief that man is so weak and inadequate that he is unable to govern himself and therefore requires the rule of strong masters. Democracy is based on the conviction that man has the moral and intellectual capacity as well as the inalienable right to govern himself with reason and justice.
He also said that countries should all come together through the United Nations to bring this agenda to life. And so the world's largest aid donor came into being. In the UK, the supposed development agenda really accelerated in the midst of decolonization and the emancipation of many countries across Africa. So in 1968, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, or FCO, was created by essentially combining various existing structures, including the Foreign Office and what was then the Colonial Office. So the C essentially stood for colonial before it stood for Commonwealth. In 1997, the Labour government created the Department for International Development, or DFID for short. We know this was later merged, and so we are back to something that combines the historic and the recent history, the Department for Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. And across Europe, we have seen very similar structures being created, sometimes through mergers and sometimes without.
And that's it, in a very small nutshell. But honestly, there's so much more to say about the history of development. So someone please tell the rest is history. We'd love to come on and do a dedicated episode with them. Right. So thanks again, Lorriann, for that overview. Really concise, really useful. And honestly, not to put too fine a point on it, but truly, as two people that have worked in the sector for a long time, there are very few colleagues of ours that know the full history of development, let alone the wider public. And I think the assumption, again, is still that it was simply born out of some sense of benevolence, charity, goodwill on behalf of so-called rich countries after recovering, recovery truly picked up after World War II. So that's a very brief look backwards. But if we're looking forwards, Lorriann, how does the development sector today work?
Okay, so let's take it to the World Bank. The World Bank has essentially categorized countries into 4 main groups. You have some lower income countries, and then you have a group of middle income countries, which is split into 2. You have lower middle income countries. You then have upper middle income countries. And then there is a 4th tier called high income countries. Those groups are important because among the high income countries, a small group of them have come together and they form a bit of a club. And that club sits inside an institution that you will have heard the acronym OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And within the OECD is a particular committee, and that committee is called the Development Assistance Committee. And the Development Assistance Committee sets and writes the rules about aid and development. And so, for example, one rule that the committee has written is that funding, in order for funding to count as aid, it has to go to a country that is in one of those categories below. So it has to go to a country that is in a lower middle income group, the upper middle income group, or a low income group. That is a basic starting point. Now, you might think that if there was a committee that's set up to write some rules about aid, that they may have some countries who are among the highest receivers of this aid come in there and participate and set the agenda and write the rules, but no. They are not allowed to participate as members. It's possible that they can assert some level of influence through some tangential routes, as can civil society, but the membership of the Development Assistance Committee is limited to the members of the OECD. And so the governments who give aid set the rules and decide what is and is not aid, and where it can and cannot go, and what it can and cannot do.
So what happens next? Okay, well, that is tricky because it actually depends on the very specific policies and approaches of each of those countries that Lorriann was talking about, the DAC countries, DAC donors, as they're commonly known. So you're now in the know. You know what a DAC donor is. So the government, department, or ministry or body that's responsible for the aid and development agenda will then often draft some sort of a strategy, a policy document, a white paper, something like that, a guiding document. And in this document, they will outline a few things, so including the countries they will give money to, again, that have to be on the list that Lorriann was talking about, the areas and sectors they will prioritize. So some common ones would include things like health, agriculture, conflict prevention, climate, gender equality. There's a very long list. By the way, important to note here is that humanitarian aid is distinct from development aid. But when we talk about foreign aid, we're referring to both as a catch-all. So these strategies, these documents, these policies, they're time limited, okay, which means they usually only cover a period of around 3 to 5 years. It's hard to generalize, but that's a good rule of thumb, which basically is until a new government or a new minister takes over. So it's time limited. Now, some of the money is spent directly from governments, that the DAC donors that we've been talking about, and some goes to what are called multilateral organizations. And we've all heard of at least one, things like the United Nations. And the United Nations has all these different branches, so it could be any one of those. The World Bank that Lorriann mentioned, and many, many more. So you've kind of got this bilateral aid, government to those countries on the list, and then multilateral, which is from the DAC donor to the multilateral organization to the countries on the list. So it all starts to get quite complicated. But once the strategies and the decisions about how to spend the money are in place, the money can start, or in some cases continue to flow if there were pre-existing programs. Okay, so where is the money spent? Well, it can only count as foreign aid, which, by the way, we're going to introduce another technical term here, which is Official Development Assistance, or ODA. So again, you're in the know. Now you know what a DAC donor is, and you know that DAC donors spend ODA, foreign aid. So ODA only counts as ODA by the rules set by this committee if it goes to countries on what is known as the DAC list of recipients that Lorriann mentioned. So if the country isn't on the list, the money cannot count as ODA. So it can still send money, but it wouldn't count towards their ODA budgets and their targets. And on the list that Lorriann mentioned, there are currently over 150 countries on the list, okay? And these are places that we would collectively refer to as the Global South, but there's many other terms. Importantly, the list is reviewed every year, or every 3 years, to be more accurate, to see if any countries will, quote-unquote, graduate, meaning if they become too rich to receive aid, they'll fall off the list, and then DAC donors can no longer send ODA money to those countries. So you're probably still saying, though, Alex, yes, I understand which countries are getting it. You've explained that exhaustively, but who gets the money? Well, I'm going to have to ask you to stay tuned because we're going to cover that in detail in episode 4 with a fantastic guest. So let's leave it there for now.
Okay, let's talk about how much money is being spent. And this varies a lot depending on the country giving the money. Back in 1970, the United Nations set a target that every so-called developed country should aim to spend 0.7% of their gross national income, or GNI, on development assistance. So this is essentially all of the money that the government takes in income within 1 year. The UN said if all the rich countries around the world were to allocate less than 1%, 0.7% of that money to development assistance, then that would raise the financing that would be needed to deliver the sorts of big development goals and ambitions that we have all set for ourselves. And so since the 1970s, when this target was first set, it has become a big rallying call, a big way in which we judge how generous a country is in terms of their approach to foreign assistance and supporting other governments. But in reality, very few countries have ever met this target. And there are examples of countries that have met it in some years, actually met it consistently over a number of years, and then they've gone backwards. Some, Denmark, Luxembourg, Norway, Sweden are all examples of countries that have, at least at some point in their past, met and in some cases even exceeded the 0.7% target. The UK became one of the first G7 countries to meet this target and did so until very recently when Rishi Sunak announced aid cuts after the COVID-19 pandemic. And it's also important to say that the 0.7 target is a measure of just that. It's a measure of how generous the country is, in that it shows what share of their income they allocate for development assistance goals and objectives. However, it does not tell you very much about the volume of aid, because countries have the size of a country's economies are very different. And so although we see examples of countries like Luxembourg who have allocated sometimes 1% of their development assistance budgets to ODA or foreign aid, historically, the biggest aid donor has been the US, even though its own as a share of the US economy, or the share of the US's national income, its ODA contribution accounts for about 0.22% in 2024. But that 0.22% is still more than what all the other governments were contributing.
That's right. So as you can see, it starts to get more and more complicated. But essentially, we've got our list of we've got our list of countries. Some are quote unquote donors and some are quote unquote recipients. We've got strategies put in place. We've got rules governing how the money gets spent. We've got a target for how much money should be spent. But then it gets even more complicated once the budgets are set and the money is committed. So in a very, very, very small nutshell, countries give the money to different organizations, so both non-profit and also companies. It's really important at this point. It's not just the charities that you'll hear about in the mainstream media. There are a lot of companies operating in the private sector as well that are receiving this foreign aid money, this ODA, to implement different projects. Now, almost impossible to summarize here, Lorriann, but let me give it a go. This could be for physical projects, so things like building roads or creating health infrastructure, like building clinics, or for more what we would call intangible projects, such as promoting peace and security, the example that Lorriann gave earlier about women's economic empowerment. Mm-hmm. These things are harder to measure in bricks and mortar, but they constitute a very large proportion of the types of projects that are funded. So you might be wondering, well, how long are these projects? They can run anywhere from a few months to up to 10 years in some cases. Mm-hmm. That's more and more increasingly rare, I would say. But most are around 5 years, which is the length of one government term in most countries. So the DAC donor who gives the money is then responsible for overseeing the projects. So that's the donor, not the country where the project is being implemented. And that also includes making arrangements for what is known as monitoring and evaluation. That's another technical term in the sector, and it's basically, have the projects met their goals or not, in a nutshell. Oh, and just by the way, the vast majority of projects are run by organizations from the donor countries, the DAC donors, not from the countries where the money is sent. But we'll get into all of that later when we talk about our myths. It's a real bugbear of ours, and we have a lot to say, but not quite yet.
Okay, so let's take it all back in the shortest possible summary. Here's what we want you to understand, that you essentially have a club, which is a group of high-income countries. They've come together, they formed this club. Many of these high-income countries were involved in historical injustices, and they have decided that they will give a tiny slice of their national income to support other countries as they try to deal with the climate crisis, or as they try to address poverty and the health conditions and education and all of these other goals and objectives. But crucially, they maintain the power. They decide how much they spend. They decide when they spend. They decide they can cut off the tap at any moment, as you heard about in episode 1 in Aid in the News. They decide where it goes. They decide who it goes through, which agencies that they're going to fund it through. So they maintain the power in this relationship.
Yeah, I think that pretty much sums it up, Lorriann. But we also know that this is a lot to take in. So in each episode, we're going to break down specific aspects of everything we just talked about to show you what we mean, not just tell you. And we also have, I have to say, an incredible lineup of guests. So please stay tuned to welcome them with us.
Thank you. And we promise this is as technical as it gets, but we thought it was important to kind of give this overview so that we were not talking around an issue, and you at least have this chance to get an overview of how the system and the structure works. Okay, thank you for listening to our podcast today. We appreciate your time.
You've heard it all before, but if you like what you've heard, or at the very least are mildly intrigued, please subscribe and take a moment to rate the podcast. You can also follow us on Instagram and YouTube. All details in the description below.
You've been amazing,
and we've been Take or Give.